Thank you very much, Dr. Francisco. I am very grateful for your invitation. Buenos días, o como decimos en mi país, kia ora. I thank the organizers of this important conference for their invitation to be with you today. I will now share my screen with you so as to take my face off the screen, and I hope you can now see the slides in front of you. I have included a map, two maps, in fact, on this first slide so that you know where New Zealand is. New Zealand, as you can see, is a very tiny little country down on the very bottom in the southwest corner of the Pacific. We are very isolated here. Consequently, our COVID cases are quite low. We measure them in the hundreds, not the thousands, and most of our cases are in the border control areas. So we have been very fortunate. Unfortunately, that means we cannot travel very much, or if we do travel, it is very difficult to return. So I very much miss the opportunity to be with you in person, since Spain is one of the most beautiful countries I have ever visited, and I would very much value an opportunity to do so again. Since I lived and worked in Southern California, USA for some time, I learned to speak some Spanish and to communicate with my clients and staff. And I thank you for your indulgence today as I present in English. Over the past year, I've been engaged in researching and writing a book with the working title, The Origins of Social Care, and I hope the interpreters translate that as cuidado and not asistencia, because it is cuidado that I am focusing on. The Origins of Social Care and Social Work, Creating a Global Future. It's due with the publisher in September, so I'm pleased to say it's nearly finished. This project has led me to some fascinating research on social work and the history of social care and social work, and that's why I've chosen this topic for my presentation. In general, when we hear about international social work, what we usually hear about is this is how social work is practiced in country A or region B or with population C. However, we rarely, and occasionally we hear about transnational issues such as migration or refugees, migrants, climate change, and so forth. We also hear about efforts from Western countries to develop social work in some developing countries. But we must ask ourselves whether this is merely replicating colonialism in those developing countries. I think an important question for the discipline of social work now is whether we can agree on a kind of unified global response to the challenges of social and economic oppression, inequalities, and injustice around the world. I come with a background of experience in international social work. I have done in-country consultations for UNICEF, for WHO, the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, the Secretariat of the Pacific Community, and other organizations in Pacific and Asia. And I served for many years on the Asia Pacific Association for Social Work Education and the International Association of Schools of Social Work. And in addition to the usual committee work, I served on the task forces that developed both the international global definition of social work and the Global Social Work Statement of Ethical Principles, both of which I think are core documents for international social work today. And all of that has brought me to the question of whether social work can be a global profession. I've had the privilege of listening to and learning from social work practitioners, educators, and researchers around the world. And I think this question is possibly one of the most challenging we are facing as a profession today. Social work is certainly one of the most fundamental international disciplines, to be sure. And I think we need, and it is always informed by local practice and local culture. And it's informed by our ways of understanding and interpreting knowledge. As a gay man, I'm very familiar with navigating the boundaries of different epistemologies of being simultaneously both an insider and an outsider. I have grown to love social work very deeply because it is the most human of all the human service work, because it requires an authentic relationship between clients and workers. The work that we do is significant because social workers are responsible for working with the most vulnerable and marginalized peoples in the world. And that means what you and I do as social work practitioners, educators, and researchers matters very much. It is important. The origins of social work and social care, I should say, in every culture are ancient. They date back millennium, way back to the 24th century BCE in Mesopotamia, and into the 6th century BCE in Asia. The Code of Hammurabi, then there's a picture of the code, that steel, that rock of the Code of Hammurabi is on the slide there, established that the responsibility of caring for the orphan, the widow, and the poor was the responsibility of the elites, the royal court and its nobility. In the 4th century CE, the Roman Emperor Constantine struck a deal with the early Christian church. You take care of the poor, the sick, the orphan, and the widow, and keep them out of sight, and I will legalize Christianity in the Roman Empire. The early church took that deal and constructed the first orphanages, hospitals, and care homes in Constantinople, which is now Istanbul, of course, and then throughout the empire. The church collaborated with civil authorities and for the first time created a class of poor, a category of poor, in order to help the emperor maintain social order in what became the Christian West. That arrangement continued for 1,000 years until the Great Plague of 1348, when the civic authorities had to take over because too many members of the church were dying. The church did not have the resources to take care of the massive number of immigrants that were flocking from the countrysides to the cities during that era. I argue that in the Christian era, in Greater Europe, North America, and their colonies around the world, social care has largely been shaped by particular religious notions of who is worthy of care and how it should be delivered or not, by whom and to whom. In the Gospels of Christianity, in the New Testament, the poor are lifted up, they are celebrated, they are exalted. And in the book of Acts, we read that Christians held all things in common and appointed specific persons to care for the widow and the poor. However, in 2 Thessalonians, one of Paul's letters, which is possibly one of the earliest parts of the New Testament, dating from 50 CE, the Apostle Paul wrote these very difficult words. Even when we were with you, we gave you this command: anyone unwilling to work should not eat. Now, Paul was writing to a church, a group of believers who believed that Jesus was coming back very soon. And so they were prepared to abandon their work and sit there watching the sky, waiting for Jesus' return. That was Paul's context, but his words got interpreted, particularly by St. Augustine, as words that said, if you don't earn your keep, then you are not worthy of receiving assistance. Those words, anyone unwilling to work should not eat, changed everything. It was adopted as a foundation for the requirement that in order to receive any kind of assistance, the poor had to work. The right or expectation of assistance had become a privilege. Since that time, social care, or what we know now as social work, has not been secular. The process of assessment and delivery of care were developed and codified by the researcher Graziani, who synthesized church canon law, legal government civic practices, statutory requirements, and so forth. And his work, the Decretum Graziani, became the foundation of the poor laws throughout Europe, and later its colonies, that anyone who needed public assistance should be found worthy in order to receive that assistance. That requirement appeared in medieval Catholicism and later Protestant theologies, and it endures today in most countries, and particularly those which live under neoliberal domination. Those values were exported around the world during what is kindly called the Age of Exploration, that period of colonization and capitalism when European values were imposed on indigenous peoples throughout the world in the interest of profit for European traders and investors. Now, we in the 21st century are the inheritors of those attitudes and values, whether we're aware of them or not. Most of us are not aware of them, for they're part of what Taylor calls the social imaginary. They are just the way things always have been, and we don't realize that we have inherited those Christian attitudes. For millennia, thousands of years, it was the responsibility of the elites to care for the poor. Now, in the Christian West, it became the responsibility of the poor to earn their assistance. Most of us in the developed West have no idea how social care was carried out amongst Hindu, Buddhist, Confucian, or Shinto cultures, in Islam, or amongst indigenous Africans. Only very recently has social work taken into account the violence perpetuated by colonial hegemony on indigenous peoples in their tribal lands in what we know now as North, Central, and South America, which I am deliberately not calling Latin America in this context, in Australia, and in the Pacific Islands. If we are not aware of our history, we will repeat that history without awareness in our practice, in our teaching, and our research. The Vedas are the earliest body of Indian scripture. They were composed in Vedic Sanskrit, probably between 1500 and 700 BCE, and form the foundation of what is considered the world's oldest religion, Hinduism, which has about 1.2 billion adherents, or about 15% of the world's population. The Vedas teach that the material body is an illusion, and that this illusion is the source of suffering, sometimes called unsatisfactoriness. The material body and its extended social identities such as gender, caste, relationships, politics, citizenship, and the so forth have no connection with the actual essential self. But the body is intended to help the self on its journey to spiritual liberation from the cycle of birth and rebirth in the world and towards enlightenment. Caring for the individual from a Vedic perspective, then, is ancient. The caregiver themselves models detachment from those externalities in order to connect with the essential self. And that means that care provision was historically provided by advanced practitioners of faith in temples, monasteries, or religious houses. And as in most models of social care, the caregiver encounters the person where they are. If they are hungry, they must be fed. If they are naked, they must be clothed. And in providing this help, the practitioner helps the person realize the true source of their essential self, with a view eventually to helping them escape from the limits of the body. In South Asia, Hindus, Jains, and Sikhs each have a different understanding of poverty and how to respond to the poor. When I was in Delhi 2 years ago, before COVID, I had the opportunity for a tour of a Sikh temple. And on the top right-hand section of the slide there, you see a Sikh temple kitchen where they prepare vast quantities of food to feed anyone who is in need every day. And I was astonished at the amount of soup, the amount of rice, the amount of bread that is provided in those kitchens. However, one of the problems with the ways Hindus provide care is that to provide care for poor persons who are usually of lower caste, the individual risks being contaminated by the lower caste. And so many care providers migrated into Buddhist communities. Buddhism dates from around the 6th century BCE, was founded, as I'm sure you know, by Prince Siddhartha Gautama, an ascetic seeker who eventually became the Buddha, the enlightened one. As in Hinduism, a Buddhist approach to the poor proposes that they have no attachment to the physical being of this world, and that by being free from worry and craving, they open up the possibility for achieving emancipation or freedom from suffering by overcoming those base human emotions that cause problems, emotions like greed, hate, and delusion. In India or South Asia, Emperor Ashoka converted to Buddhism after a great battle in the 2nd century, and he was appalled by the amount of death and suffering that he saw. And Ashoka ordered the construction of what we would recognize as hospitals and committed himself and his officers to work for the welfare of the poor and the aged. He issued his edicts on rocks so that they would never fade away. And in the edict, talking about the construction of hospitals and committing himself to the well-being of the poor is on that photo on the lower left-hand portion of the slide. During that same era, Gongzu, better known to us as Confucius, and his contemporary Lao Tzu advocated for a relational view of social order. Each person knew their place and was in a relationship with the social or political class above them or below them. In this way, social harmony was maintained and everyone looked after their own families. This mutual care promoted social stability. Attending to one's social role and one's relationship avoids poverty. A Confucian perspective, then, is the inverse of Maslow's famous hierarchy of needs. Responding to poverty focuses not on basic physical needs, but on affirming the value of the person from a holistic perspective in the context of their relationships. And this is something that in the post-Enlightenment West, we don't really understand very well. In a Confucian system, it is the responsibility of the ruling authority to ensure social harmony by minimizing the gap between the wealthy and the poor. And in this way, social stability is maintained. Similarly, Lao Tzu's Taoism stresses balance and the interconnectedness of the individual with their social arrangements. Those notions of relationship, interdependence, and interconnectedness are very far from Western values of independence, autonomy, individualism. And the response to poor within our various cultures is shaped by those assumptions. Together, you can see that interconnectedness creates greater possibilities than the isolation that individuals live apart from one another. In indigenous sub-Saharan Africa, the notion of Ubuntu, I am because we are, has become so important to international social work that it became the focus of World Social Work Day on the 15th of March this year. Ubuntu is a Swahili word that understands that social relationships are of the a primary good. They are the foremost of importance, and they are transcendent sources of value. To express Ubuntu is to affirm one's own humanity by recognizing the humanity of others and choosing the well-being of others over personal gain. Nobel Prize winner, Anglican Archbishop Desmond Tutu of South Africa wrote that Ubuntu is the essence of being human. It provides resilience and enables people to survive and to emerge as human, despite all efforts to dehumanize them. It not only takes a village in indigenous Africa to raise a child, but to care for the entire family from birth to death and beyond. Islam, as I am sure you know, built its social care structures from early Arabic business associations. In Islam, all faithful people have a duty to work for a just and equal society, including regular giving to support the poor, the emancipation and protection of women through the granting of legal rights of inheritance and divorce, education, and the moral and spiritual equality of the sexes. In Islam, the poor are not theologized or philosophized as a class of persons, but as individuals who naturally exist in any society and who must be cared for by the entire society. Is the notion of Islam was spread through conquest, through business and trade arrangements, and through mixed marriages in Arabia, South Asia and Central Asia and North Africa, and through into Iberia and Eastern Europe. The notion of relationship as the foundation of a stable society, and in order to maintain social harmony, is not limited to Confucian-based Taoist and Ubuntu cultures. Indigenous cultures throughout the world foreground relationships, interdependence, and mutual care, and maintaining social harmony. In Pacifica cultures, that is, cultures of the Pacific Ocean, the Aina refers not merely to the immediate or nuclear family, as it would in most Western cultures, but to the larger extended family, including in-laws, distant cousins, and their spouses. The behavior of one member reflects on the entire group. Rituals such as ifonga, adapted by other legal systems around the world as restorative justice, were developed in order to maintain peaceful relationships amongst Ainga, villages, and islands. Amongst Māori and Aotearoa New Zealand, mihi whakato, or introductions, impofuri, or welcoming ceremonies, begin by identifying one's whakapapa, a kind of genealogy that identifies one's mountain, one's river, the canoe in which one's ancestors arrived, or in my case, the airplane or ship, one's founding ancestors, one's turanga waiwai, the land or place where one was born or brought up, and important iwi or tribal, hapu, subtribal, or whānau or kin relationships. Thank you to the interpreter for keeping up with all that Maori. The speaker establishes themselves in relationship to their land, their ancestors, and their extended family when they introduce themselves. And by locating themselves in this nexus of relationships, the speaker identifies where and to whom they belong. Similarly, Indigenous Australian and Torres Straits Islanders identify the importance of land, culture, and spirituality and community in maintaining what Westerners call mental health or balance. It was colonization and the accompanying missionization that disrupted those relationships, separated Indigenous peoples from their lands, their roots, and their peoples, and created imbalance and disrupted those societies severely. This imbalance, however, allowed colonizers easier control. Along the bottom there of those photos, you see pictures of Indigenous peoples throughout the Pacific, from Samoa, from Fiji, from Micronesia, from Fiji, and other Indigenous cultures. Now this takes us to Aotearoa, New Zealand. I was asked to say something about what's going on in Aotearoa, New Zealand, so I will pause for just a moment to do that. You've seen what a little tiny country we are of 5 million people on the bottom of most maps. In fact, sometimes we're left off the map. The British arrived in the 19th century. It is thought that the Maori arrived, however, between the 8th and the 10th century, and they are understood as the indigenous peoples of New Zealand. To summarize a complicated history quite briefly, in 1840, the British and the indigenous Maori created Te Tiriti, or the Treaty of Waitangi, to formalize their relationship. Waitangi is a place, and that is the place where the treaty was signed. This treaty forms part of the constitutional arrangements of Aotearoa, New Zealand. Aotearoa means land of the long white cloud and is the indigenous name for New Zealand and is included as part of the overall country name. Yes, New Zealand is named after fog. In return for ceding governance to the British Crown in the first article of the treaty, the British promised to respect Maori rights to self-determination, tino rangatiratanga, over their lands and their treasures. The third article grants British citizenship to Maori. The treaty exists in it's quite short, and you'll see the arrow pointing to the original treaty, which is now in the country's archives, on the left-hand side of the screen as you look at it. The treaty exists in 2 languages, in English and Te Reo Māori, and the versions differ. Not all Maori chiefs present signed both versions. In other words, the treaty is contentious and it's confusing. Interpretations and understandings differ, and they are sometimes dramatically different. The treaty was almost immediately dishonored by the British, and Maori and traditional lands were confiscated, stolen, or bought at very undervalued prices. Maori were dislocated from their traditional lands, villages, social and kin networks, and first forced into urban areas to find work. While Maori children were not removed from their parents at the same scale as Australian or Canadian First Nations children, they were still removed. Maori language was forbidden in schools. Poverty, disease, homelessness, and alcohol abuse became endemic. What is now called the Maori Renaissance occurred only in the 1970s. Government investment in Maori health and social services increased dramatically. Maori language courses were created. Maori immersion schools, places where only Maori, schools where only Maori is spoken, kura kaupapa, were created. A permanent tribunal was established in 1975 to hear land and resource claims brought by Maori tribes against the Crown, and to date, over $1 billion has been awarded in treaty tribunal settlements, and that is ongoing. In 1987, Maori was designated as one of the 3 official languages of Aotearoa, New Zealand, along with New Zealand Sign Language and English, and official documents became bilingual. A very critical report in 1988 resulted in significant changes in social work, and social work in New Zealand now understands itself as bicultural and bilingual. In 2010, a By Maori for Maori social care fund was established. So there have been significant changes over the past few years. Still, approximately 15% of the population is Maori, over 50% of the prison population is Maori. 56% of child removals from family homes are amongst Maori. The national unemployment rate was 4.9%, but it is double that amongst Maori and 20% amongst young Maori. Life expectancy for Mauritani is 73 years for men, and for Wahine or women, it's 77.7 years. Amongst Tauiwi or non-Maori, it is 80.9 and 84.4 years respectively. So clearly there is much more work to do. Aotearoa, New Zealand also hosts a very large number of migrants from Pacifica nations, and Auckland, which has a population of 1.2 million, is considered the largest Pacifica city in the world. Many of these Pacifica migrants are economic migrants, but some are also climate refugees from island nations in the Pacific that are slowly disappearing due to rising sea levels. We anticipate a migration crisis in the Pacific as more and more peoples are dislocated. For instance, the government of Kiribati has bought land in Fiji and plans to relocate its entire population to Fiji as the island gradually disappears. You'll see there are some of the flags of various nations throughout of the Pacific nations. And you'll note that on most of them, the Southern Cross features very prominently. All of these challenges mean that social workers in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and throughout the Pacific are constantly addressing challenges brought about by colonization, and will be doing so for the foreseeable future. Coming back to our original question, can social work be a global profession? I think that is a very complicated question. I argue that Christianized European colonial nations sustain and perpetuate their colonial pasts in the present day. In case you are not yet convinced of the urgency or relevance of my argument that Western social work must critique its Western epistemology and Christian roots and learn from other global philosophies, let's look at some population data. You will see that non-Abrahamic religious adherents, Hindu, Sikh, Jain, Buddhist, and so forth, make up 1.88 billion people around the world. Confucian-influenced countries make up 1.71 billion people around the world. If you add to those people, Black Indigenous persons in Africa and in the diaspora, we added an additional 1.5 million. The World Bank estimates that there are 500 million Indigenous peoples throughout the world. What that means is that there are roughly 5.6 billion people, or 71.6% of the world population, that do not share Western epistemologies. That is a significant part of the world population. I will move quickly through this next part because I'm sure you know it very well. So the global definition of social work in 2014 was developed after a significant amount of consultation throughout the world, and for the first time acknowledged the existence of Indigenous knowledges and the need for social harmony as part of social work's understanding of itself. But that definition was not uncontroversial. Latin American social workers, I know, felt that it did not go far enough to challenge oppressive state regimes, and German social workers felt that the idea of Indigenous was irrelevant to them and attempted to exclude it from their version, misunderstanding that they were former colonizers. Buddhist social workers have created alternative definitions today, noting that in the global definition, one could read individualism, modernism, and Christianity between the lines. While the 2014 definition is a major step forward, it is only a temporary step, I think, while social work stops and critiques its dominant Western Christian epistemologies and tries to become truly global in its scope. The other part of my question, can social work be a global profession, is related to whether social work is or can be a profession, as opposed to an occupation, a discipline, or a trade. There are many definitions of profession, and I won't try your patience by going through them. My list of the attributes of profession are listed on the slide there. They include a clearly defined and altruistic purpose, transmissible theoretical knowledge, specialized skills, commonly held values and enforceable ethics, a high degree of individual responsibility and autonomy in decision-making, self-governing association with a credentialing process and accountability to others, and public and political recognition as a distinct professional group. Without going into every step of my reason, I think you'll probably agree with me that social work meets some of these criteria in some places around the world, most of them in a few places, and all of them in none. Using the criteria I've set out above, the best we can say is that social work has a lot of work to do. It's a quasi-profession in some countries, but certainly not in all. And in some, such as Bangladesh, it's not even recognized as an occupation. So another challenge to conceptualizing social work is its social control function, where social work is seen as an occupation that works on behalf of the state. Since the era of Constantine, that has been a challenge for social work, and it's difficult for us to talk about emancipation and self-fulfillment when we're working on behalf of state institutions. I've condensed a very complex issue into just a few moments here, but I think the best answer we can give to whether social work is a profession or can be a global profession is it depends. It depends on where you are, who you work with, and the kind of work you do. If addressing the question as to whether social work is a global profession is important to social workers, there are 4 options. First, continue the current system, where globally social work is recognized or not, either as an occupation or profession, regulated in some place or not regulated, depending on the political context. That means abandoning the notion of a global profession, at least for the present. Or we can reconceptualize the notion of profession to allow or encourage government regulation of practitioners, scopes of practice, education, and practice standards, providing this regulation is led by qualified social workers. This option would mean that this new structural form of profession should advocate for state recognition and regulation in nations and territories where such regulation does not currently exist, and for specific dedicated education program and research funding categories. Third, we can advocate for a more limited version of a state-regulated profession, which means delegating to states only administrative processes that are required to ensure that states implement criteria for the recognition of individual practitioners that are set by independent associations of social workers. But that means that there have to be robust associations of social workers everywhere. Or fourthly, we can decide that only a fully independent status will ensure that the core values of social justice and human dignity for the widow, the orphan, and the poor are established, and we reclaim autonomy and regulatory authority from the states. In most places, that means that law changes, possible loss of title protection, and developing the infrastructure and resourcing to manage the profession would have to occur, and we would set standards for ourselves. That would probably be very welcome to indigenous peoples who wish to maintain a distant relationship with any kind of regulatory authority and its colonial legacy, but it would also be very difficult to do. There may be other possibilities that people smarter than I will suggest. Can social work be a profession globally? Yes, if we really want it. But if we really want to be truly global, we as social workers will need to critique our Western and Christian-dominated epistemologies, become aware of the impact of our colonial histories, whether we were colonizers or colonized, and be prepared to engage with an open mind and an open heart, Asian, African, Islamic, and indigenous epistemologies. We need to decide whether we want to claim the notion of profession to elevate the status of social work and the women who do it, and that we want the same standard of practice in every country and profession. And we're going to have to want it very much, because this will be a huge project stretching over many years. Kia ora, mihi nui kia koutou. Muchas gracias.